Hello everybody. Welcome to our fourth meeting. Fourth meeting, almost a hand, not yet. Anyways, it is midterm season and we appreciate you being here today with us to learn some knowledge and engage with the club. So here we go, real quick. Announcements. Mentor-mentee updates. Jane has some pretty cool news. If you'd like to share, Jane.
Yeah, so all the pairings have been made. I think everyone who's in the program should have gotten emails saying who your mentor or mentee is, and I believe most have made initial contact, so that's very exciting. And we just made a Slack channel for everyone in the mentorship program, and I believe we will probably have like a family social maybe week 7 or 8. We're going to release a poll in the Slack channel just so that we can all get to know each other between our pairs even better, and then also the other pairs as well. So yes, very exciting events to come.
Awesome. Thank you, Jane. And I believe all aboard is also going to be in the chat, so we'll be helping out as well. And for spring recruitment, just a little. Okay, if you can let people in the waiting room, that'll be great. But spring recruitment, just a little reminder. Everyone's doing really well, but where am I going with this? Oh, right, typo there. But spring recruitment is occurring in spring quarter, and we'll be, looking for new members as well as potential new leaders in our club. So just, be aware of attendance, showing commitment, yada, yada. You guys are doing fantastic. Anyways, and we're also planning tentatively to have a new committee that's doing physician shadowing. That's, to be determined later on, but just to start thinking about ideas you might want to present to us in your apps and interviews and so on. Awesome. And that's all the reminders I have for today. And today we have a very special icebreaker from one of our members here. Very exciting opportunity. Kovir, why don't you go ahead and share your 2 questions here?
Okay. Are we going to breakout rooms?
You can read them out loud while I'll make breakout rooms. Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, so today was very animal themed. I don't know why, but it's going to be fun. First question is, assuming you could befriend any one animal, again, assuming it would not eat you. So like it's safe if you choose a tiger. And it can be aquatic or terrestrial. What would you choose to be friends with on a desert island and why? And 2 things to keep in mind here are your decision can be informed by both sentimental and realistic value of that animal. And secondly, we have, if there were any one species you could choose to run the government, what would it be?
Very nice. Okay, I'm gonna open 8 breakout rooms. Why don't you guys can talk amongst yourself for the first question, and we'll have you share the second question when we come back. All right, opening up the rooms now, and recording. All right, awesome.
Okay, so this presentation is starting off a little different, and we have a case study where there's a celebrity on the screen, and it's someone who has had or has a neurological disorder. And on the right, there's some like symptoms or conditions that they had, and I want you guys to think about these symptoms. And in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, guess what neurological disorder they had. So today's celebrity is Prince, and if you don't know who that is, he was a legendary performer, musician, singer, songwriter, and I believe he's really famous like during the 80s, and he passed away in 2016. And he was actually born with a neurological disorder, and he used to have seizures, especially at a young age, and severe headaches. And other people who have the same condition as him, they usually experience a loss of consciousness, psychic symptoms like fear and anxiety, uncontrollable jerking movements of the arms and legs. And the neurological disorder that he had, it's actually really common. 3.4 million people in the United States have a history of it, and it affects both children and adults. So if you want to guess in the chat what he had. Okay, yeah, Sasha guessed it, epilepsy. So that's what you guys were good. That's what our presentation is going to be on today. So yeah, Prince was born with epilepsy, and he actually talked about in an interview about how he used to have constant seizures, and I think he ended up actually getting treated for it at around 9 years old.
Yeah, so like we said, we're going to be going over epilepsy for today's presentation. It's a pretty common disorder, so it's important to understand how to recognize it and understand just more about it and what it is and what causes it. And so now we'll start with an intro to epilepsy, and we'll start off with a general overview video that we'll be showing in the next slide.
Wait, sorry, can you guys hear it? Or
No, we can't.
You
We
can?
can't.
Can't?
No.
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 Okay, because I'm muted. All right, here we go again.
Epilepsy means seizure disorder. So people with epilepsy have recurring and unpredictable seizures. A seizure is a period where cells in the brain, or neurons, are synchronously active, or active at the same time, when they're not supposed to be. Now, when I say neurons are active, I mean that they're firing or sending a message using electrical signals relayed from neuron to neuron. And if you look at a neuron under a microscope, each electrical signal that passes through it is really just ions flowing in and out through protein channels. The way this ion flow is controlled is through neurotransmitters, a type of signaling molecule, and receptors. Neurotransmitters bind to the receptors and basically tell the cell to either open up the ion channels and relay the electrical message, called excitatory neurotransmitters, or close the ion channels and stop the electrical message, called inhibitory neurotransmitters. During a seizure, clusters of neurons in the brain become temporarily impaired and start sending out a ton of excitatory signals over and over again. And these are sometimes said to be paroxysmal. These paroxysmal electrical discharges are thought to happen due to either too much excitation or too little inhibition, which are kind of two sides of the same coin, right? The main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain is glutamate, and NMDA is the primary receptor that responds to glutamate by opening ion channels that let calcium in, a positive ion that tells the cell to send signals. Some patients with epilepsy seem to have fast or long-lasting activation of these receptors. On the flip side, the main inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain is GABA, which binds to GABA receptors that tell the cell to inhibit the signal by opening channels that let in chloride ions, which are negative ions that tell the cell to inhibit signals. Some patients with epilepsy seem to have genetic mutations in which their GABA receptors are dysfunctional, and so they aren't able to inhibit signals. In addition to potentially having a primary genetic cause, though, these receptors and ion channels might be affected by all sorts of things like brain tumors, brain injury, or infection. Whether it's a decrease in inhibition or an increase in activation, when groups of neurons start firing simultaneously over and over, it's often noticed by others as obvious outward signs like jerking, moving, and losing consciousness, but can also be subjective experiences that are only noticed by the person experiencing it, like fears or strange smells. It all depends on which neurons in the brain are affected. People with epilepsy experience recurring episodes of some form of seizures, and we can start grouping the seizures by the region of the brain that's affected. When the affected area is limited to one hemisphere or one half of the brain, or sometimes even a smaller area like a single lobe, we call it a partial or a focal seizure. These seizures can be subcategorized by whether someone remains conscious during the seizure, which is called a simple partial seizure, or whether someone has impaired consciousness during the seizure, which is called a complex partial seizure. Simple partial seizures typically affect a small area of the brain and can involve the person experiencing strange sensations like hearing or tasting something, but can also involve jerking movements in specific muscle groups if the neurons controlling those muscles are affected. If the jerking activity starts in a specific muscle group and spreads to surrounding muscle groups as more neurons are affected, it's referred to as a Jacksonian march. Typically, the person is conscious, meaning that they're awake and alert, and will usually know that something's happening and will remember the seizure afterwards. Complex partial seizures, on the other hand, involve losing consciousness completely or having impaired awareness and responsiveness, so they might not remember exactly what happened during a seizure. Now, in contrast to the partial or focal seizure, a generalized seizure is where both hemispheres of the brain are affected. Sometimes the seizure will start out as a partial seizure and then quickly develop into a generalized seizure. And in those situations, it'd be called a secondary generalized seizure because a partial seizure came before it and was the primary event. Just like partial seizures, there are some subcategories of generalized seizures as well. One subtype is a tonic seizure, where the muscles all of a sudden become stiff and flexed, which can cause the patient to fall, often backwards. On the flip side, though, they can be atonic as well, where their muscles suddenly relax and become floppy, which again can cause the patient to fall, but this time forward. Seizures can also be clonic, where they have violent muscle contractions, also known as convulsions. Tonic-clonic seizures are the most common generalized seizures, where patients experience a tonic phase where the muscles suddenly tense up, followed by a clonic phase where the muscles rapidly contract and relax. Myoclonic seizures are yet another type, and are short muscle twitches, sometimes just a single twitch, but sometimes many in a short amount of time. Finally, there are absence seizures, where the patients lose consciousness and then quickly regain consciousness, generally with the only outward sign being that the person looks like they spaced out. Like if they were walking, they'll suddenly stand still. The key for all these is that they involve both hemispheres of the brain, and patients lose consciousness either briefly or for longer periods of time. If the seizures do last for a longer period of time, like over 5 minutes of ongoing seizures or having multiple seizures without returning to normal in between, then it's called status epilepticus. And these are usually the tonic-clonic subtype of seizures, but it can also be caused by other types that don't involve convulsions. This situation is considered a medical emergency and can be life-threatening if not treated immediately. Due to the severity of these seizures, patients are often treated acutely with benzodiazepines, which help enhance the effect of the inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA. Following a seizure, sometimes patients experience certain symptoms, like confusion, called post-ictal confusion, which means after seizure confusion. Also, patients might experience paralysis that affects the arms or the legs, usually just limited to one side of the body. And this is known as Todd's paralysis or Todd's paresis, and can last for quite a while, on average about 15 hours. And usually it subsides by itself completely after 2 days. The precise mechanism behind Todd's paralysis isn't currently well understood, but it's thought to be the result of temporary but severe suppression of activity of the area in the brain affected by the seizure. Typically, after a seizure is over, patients will have brain imaging techniques like MRI or CT scans, as well as an EEG, or electroencephalogram, which detects electrical activity in the brain. With patients who've just started having seizures, brain scans are used to find out if there are any anatomical abnormalities, like brain tumors or abnormal blood vessels that could be causing the seizures, of which would be treated surgically. Because epilepsy can vary from patient to patient in the type, severity, and frequency of the seizures, diagnosis typically involves a variety of examinations and tests in combination with a thorough evaluation of their clinical history. Once epilepsy has been diagnosed, it's often treated with daily medication, the primary form of medication being anticonvulsants, of which there are a wide variety of options available that have different targets in the brain. So the choice is based on the specific needs of the patient, including factors like age, lifestyle, other health problems, and the category or subcategory of the epilepsy syndrome. Other treatment options include epilepsy surgery, where they'll remove what's thought to be causing the seizures, like a specific part of the brain or a tumor. Nerve stimulation might also be considered, where certain nerves like the vagus nerve are stimulated, which is thought to control seizures by influencing neurotransmitter release. Also, patients might adopt a ketogenic diet, which is a diet that forces the body to burn fat instead of carbohydrates, which produces ketone bodies, which are then used by the brain as an energy source instead of glucose. Although many hypotheses have been suggested for why this seems to reduce seizures for some patients, the exact mechanism isn't very well understood. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about some statistics surrounding epilepsy. So each year, about 150,000 Americans are diagnosed with epilepsy, and over a lifetime, 1 in 26 Americans will be diagnosed with this disorder. Around 1.2% of Americans have epilepsy right now, which is about 3.4 million people nationwide. And of these 3.4 million people with epilepsy, 470,000 are children. And there's also 65 million people around the world that have epilepsy right now as well. So epilepsy can begin at any age, but the incidence rate is highest in children under the age of 2 and adults over the age of 65. And also, epilepsy is the fourth most common neurological disorder after migraines, stroke, and Alzheimer's. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about the causes of epilepsy. So in about 50% of people with epilepsy, the exact cause is unknown, but for the other 50%, the condition can be traced to various factors. So one of these factors is genetics, where one or more genes may cause the epilepsy, or it's caused by the way some genes work in the brain. Another factor that may give rise to this condition is severe head trauma, and this is most common in young adults. Brain conditions that cause damage to the brain, such as tumors and strokes, can also lead to epilepsy, and this is the most common in middle age and older adults. Prenatal injury may also give rise to this condition. So before birth, babies are sensitive to brain damage caused by factors such as infection in the mother, poor nutrition, or oxygen deficiencies. And individuals with developmental disorders such as autism and neurofibromatosis can also experience seizures, although the exact relationship is still not clear. And lastly, infectious diseases such as meningitis and AIDS can also cause epilepsy.
Awesome. Samia, do you want me to launch the first poll?
Yeah, you can do it now.
Okay, sweet. Oh, okay. Let you guys see the results. So 32% to 68. Awesome. Okay, carry on.
So here we have a diagram depicting EEG waves for different types of seizures. EEG waves basically record the electrical activity of the brain. The waves of generalized seizures appear completely different from a normal reading because these seizures generally affect the entire brain. The difference in an EEG of a partial seizure can only be noted in one electrode, while the readings on the other electrodes appear normal. This is because partial seizures affect only one part of the brain. Next slide, please.
Okay, so now moving on to symptoms. The main symptoms of epilepsy are temporary confusion, loss of consciousness or awareness, staring spells, fear, anxiety, or deja vu, and uncontrollable jerking and movements of the arms and legs. And so epilepsy can actually cause two different types of seizures, focal and generalized. Focal seizures affect just one or some part of the brain, whereas generalized seizures affect the entire brain. Next slide, please. Tiffany, can you launch the poll?
All right, we just covered this, so expecting some good results. So which of the following is not a symptom of epilepsy? All right, not bad.
How'd we do?
We got 5 more votes. Okay, Kulveer, you did pretty well. Okay, 4 more people. If not, we'll just end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. All right. Would you like to review which one was the incorrect answer? Or yes, correct, incorrect answer?
So the correct, incorrect answer was lucid dreaming. As I said in the last slide, one of the symptoms is staring spells. So that was intended to be a little bit of a trick question, but yeah, pretty good.
All right.
All right, so moving on. Typically, physicians use neurological exams to examine behavior, mobility, and cognitive abilities. And these assessments help determine the type of epilepsy and also the severity. Sorry. Okay, and can you hear me all right? Okay, cool. And blood tests are also used to diagnose other conditions that may cause seizures, such as genetic diseases. And some tests that can be used include EEGs, CTs, MRIs, fMRIs, and others. And you may notice that all of these tests are entirely focused on the neurological side of things. And lastly, one pretty interesting analysis technique used is called Curie analysis. And this technique combines multiple neurological tests. So basically, EEG data is projected onto an MRI scan, and then that is used to pinpoint the location of the seizure inside the brain. Next slide, please. Okay, so epilepsy is primarily treated with medications. And one important thing to note about epilepsy medications is that it's often difficult to find the ideal dosage and medication type because it really depends on a lot of different factors. And these factors include the patient's age, their seizure frequency, the specific condition they have, as well as others. And because of how delicate this issue is, there are often some pretty serious side effects associated with these medications. And these include fatigue, weight gain, loss of coordination, and even things as serious as loss of bone density or depression. And another treatment option is surgery, but this can only be used when the part of the brain causing the seizures is not associated with vital functions such as speech or motor function. And some therapies include vagus nerve stimulation and deep brain stimulation, which we've actually discussed before with some other conditions. And lastly, future treatments are being developed, and they're currently trending towards MRI-guided minimally invasive surgeries, external nerve stimulation, and radiosurgery, which helps avoid risky open surgeries. Next slide.
Okay, and now we're going to watch a video that shows a real life example of someone who has epilepsy. And next slide. And in the video, there's this girl named Catherine, and she was actually diagnosed with epilepsy just before 5th grade. And she was averaging about 1 seizure per week. And in other previous presentations, the videos that we've shown you, the patient is almost always someone who's like in their late 40s or older. But this video shows how epilepsy is a neurological disease that can affect people of all ages. So Catherine was diagnosed in 5th grade, but there have been people who have been diagnosed at birth.
Catherine was diagnosed with epilepsy right before 5th grade. When a child has epilepsy, parents, especially the mom, you're always on call. So anytime the phone rings, it could have been, and it frequently was, a teacher, a nurse, a PE teacher saying, oh, the child's had a seizure.
And this is a young lady that was having regular seizures. She had been tried on maximum possible dosages of several different medications. And despite that, she was continuing to have regular seizures. She was overall averaging about a seizure a week. It would make it very difficult for her to live independently, difficult to go to college, not able to get a driver's license and drive a car.
In basketball games, she'd have I'd be watching the court and all of a sudden she'd start doing hand motions and we knew there was a seizure coming on. So I'd be down on the court, stopping the game to get her.
I actually had lunch with a woman who told me that there was a surgery available because one of her daughter's friends had it to eliminate epilepsy.
The goal of the surgery is to stop her seizures.
It entails obtaining very targeted imaging in order for us to identify adequately the anatomy and location of where we want to go. And then technically, from a neurosurgical standpoint, it's placing the laser probe directly into that area that we want to ablate. And we use a series of computers and other technology in order to make sure that we were within 0.5 millimeters of where we needed to be. So we're heating it, and we're heating it up to a certain temperature for a certain period of time so that we can create a lesion or create a hole in that area, which would ordinarily have been cut out with a scalpel, for example. Now this is a case where we use the laser to create that cut.
She'll spend one night in the hospital just for us to observe her, to make sure that she's feeling okay after waking up from being asleep. And that's much faster than going home after a traditional brain surgery where children would spend, if everything went perfectly and it was an otherwise completely healthy child, would spend 5 to 7 days in the hospital.
Catherine was only in the hospital overnight. There was one stitch that was right there that we could see. They never shaved hair. So there was one stitch which was dissolvable. And after the first 5 or 6 days, I can't even find the scar right now.
When I had epilepsy, I kind of felt like Atlas, kind of felt like that guy. And when my epilepsy was gone, I felt like the weight was off.
So the next step is we see Dr. Wolfong in November. And at that point, we start weaning Catherine off her meds very slowly. The ultimate result is 75% to 80% chance of being 100% seizure free. Look into it. There's nothing more rewarding than the possibility that your child could be epilepsy free.
All right, so moving on to some ongoing research, I'll be discussing those happening globally and at UCLA. Next slide, please. So like the other neurological disorders we've discussed, there is no cure for epilepsy. And compared to other diseases, epilepsy research is largely underfunded. But the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke conducts and supports research to better understand, develop new treatments, and ultimately prevent epilepsy. So researchers are focused on learning more about the mechanisms that lead to epileptogenesis, which is the gradual progress by which a normal brain develops epilepsy. One basic focus is investigating how neurotransmitters interact with brain cells, two of which being GABA, which inhibits activity in the central nervous system, and glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter that can arise in the spaces between brain cells and onset seizures, as we saw in the video. The two of the neurotransmitters provide a balance, but as you can see on the diagram at the right, researchers have found that an epileptic brain has higher levels of excitation and lowered levels of inhibition. And another focus is overcoming the blood-brain barrier. So researchers are also trying to manipulate the levels of P-glycoprotein to affect the response to epilepsy medications. And the last focus is helping neurons communicate with experimental medications. And can I get any guesses in the chat of which brain chemical or hormone researchers are trying to increase the activity of in order to help neurons communicate? So it's a brain hormone and it helps neurons communicate. Okay, no guesses. Tiffany, would you click this slide? Because then it will show the answer. Or whoever's presenting. Yeah, so it was serotonin. Other areas of focus are developing better model representations of the mechanisms that cause epilepsy, and also advancements in the epilepsy therapy screening program, which efficiently screens newly developed therapeutic agents, and it has led to the approval of many treatments by the FDA. Next slide, please. So ongoing research on epilepsy is also happening at the UCLA Laboratory for Epilepsy Research with Dr. Engel and his team, who are also investigating the neuronal mechanisms underlying the development of epilepsy. Their projects involve identifying biomarkers that could identify patients at high risk for epilepsy or identifying patients who've had epilepsy and what type. The methods being used to identify targets are neuroimaging of the hippocampus, and more methods can be seen in the top right corner. Ultimately, these biomarkers can be used to efficiently determine the effectiveness of therapeutic interventions and anti-epileptogenesis treatments, which counteract the development of an epileptic brain. And if any of you are interested in reading one of his research papers, here's a link in the chat. Okay. And Engel's team is also working on identifying pathological networks that develop after brain lesions during epileptogenesis with other forms of imaging, such as magnetic resonance. In general, their studies aim to define the epileptogenic network and identify which components generate the seizures. That is all for our presentation, and now it's time for a classic Quiz Wizard game.
Do an outro. This was a YouTube video. But thanks everyone for coming to our fourth meeting. I think we have our guest speaker coming on February 16th. That's Dr. Mayo. She's dope, bioengineering, and neurosurgeon. So come out, have questions. And then we have Dr. Beso coming week 10, courtesy of Artie, who's actually in her lab, which is amazing. But yeah, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day, and thanks for coming out to our meeting. We will adjourn here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.